Well, first of all, I want to congratulate you with this fantastic project and also bringing so many different people together today in an online event. I must say I was myself a little bit frustrated by the fact that this was not a physical conference because it doesn't allow you for the normal type of feedbacks to people you want to give in those better settings. Okay, but I will try not to be too long, which is always a challenge for me. And this is I want to talk about institutional changes for responsible innovation. But equally, as Wiebe has started off, I want to make two steps back. Indeed, responsible research and innovation can be articulated at project or institution level or at the level of a university. Um, I actually want to make the case as I conceived responsible innovation, first of all, as a new innovation paradigm, which, well, for some extent coexists, but is critical of two other current paradigms in place. And only a reflection on these two current paradigms in place gives us a better perspective on what we actually have to do in order to institutionalize responsible innovation. So I will shortly go into these paradigms, of course not too long, but then make the case what type of institutional changes this evolve, notably in the science policy interface, in terms of how science and research has to be funded, also in terms of how markets have to be reorganized. So, but let me go to the paradigms. The first paradigm actually is, and actually Wiebe hinted it already a little bit to that also in his talk, where in particular technologies or particular issues such as nuclear technology for military use, or space technologies, or even in technologies which has to do with access to resources, especially in the energy fields, for example. Um, it has always been the state or the national state which has been taking the responsibility for the outcomes and the risk of those technologies. Uh, Equally, it meant that the threats for what I have conceived as responsible innovation has come as a consequence with it. Um, Typical for this paradigm is that research and innovation policy is actually aimed at a technological superiority over its competitors, and the governance priorities are the control and security of resources, either when comes to energy, or now actually in COVID, and that's actually you can see that as a positive, but also as a negative regress over the market paradigm of innovation, because here you see that governments start to realize that the essential provision of medicines are not guaranteed for the population, and also not particular equipments. For instance, in uh, the Netherlands was 80% dependent on the supply of one company when it comes to particular testing material of COVID, which actually material is what you can make also by yourself in a laboratory very easily, but which is not possible because it's patented. So you see there in trying to take over control of the nations on those things, enforcing companies to make these things open if it's possible. Although in this case it can only be done by a moral appeal, which shows our essential deficits here in controlling and taking responsibilities of the outcome on how we govern technologies and innovation. Now, of course, the negative thing here is that the regress to nationalism is equally taking place, where people want to have access to the resources only for their own population and don't care about what happens in other states. We have seen this already at the global level. Now, obviously, when it comes to a market-based innovation, which is arguably the current paradigm, which was also the basis of, for example, Weber's long-term criticism, is that we have indeed, democratized in a certain way the access to technologies and its use, but we have narrowed down our responsibilities for which we actually are responsible. And in the case of market innovation, this has been narrowed down to the risk of technologies for which we have all kinds of regulations and directives and guidelines, and which are essentially conceived as constraints to the market. The essence of the policies here, of governmental policy, is actually the speed of innovation uptake, and the story is normally then the faster the better the innovation, because this contributes to macroeconomic competitive advantages. And equally also, this paradigm has its typical threats for irresponsible innovation, notably in the form of technology pushes or ignorance of ethical values. But the function of ethics is actually a constraint of the market in various ways. And an obvious way that certain things we don't market, for example, we don't clone and we don't do particular things, but we don't take actually responsibility for how to design technologies or what type of outcomes we want. Now, the responsible innovation paradigm actually tries to broaden the scope of responsibility again, both to the outcomes and risks of technologies, or as I formulated it earlier, we have to become both for the product and process size of the innovation process in a more responsible fashion. Now, this means that, of course, the socioeconomic assessment for governments is much more focused on the social desirability of its outcomes. And it's not so much the speed of the innovation uptake, but rather to become responsive to the public values underlying the type of innovations which we actually want. And this has led indeed to another way of organizing our research and innovation policy, very slowly, recently by having a much more social challenge-oriented fashion, and in the future a more mission-oriented approach. I will come back to that later. Essential to this all is that ethics is not just then seen as a constraint to the market or constraint of technologies, but becomes a driving force and helps us also to shape it. Now, in order to get this paradigm into place, we actually need to reorganize our interfaces, and this means at least 3 times of institutional changes, from which, given the time, I only will deliberate longer on one of them, and that's the dimension of open science. Now, what does this mean? I see science, open science, actually as a necessary yet still insufficient condition for ROI. I will elaborate on that a little bit later, but it's very essential if you want to have particular so-called good impacts of science. Then first of all, the quality of science needs to be good. Now, we are actually now currently in a situation, in a dominant situation, I would say, in which we actually do something else than what we want to do with what I've called the rationale of open science, which is actually very simple. The rationale is, namely, we have to share knowledge and data as early as possible in the research process with all relevant knowledge actors, because science essentially progresses through knowledge communication in collaborative settings. Yet the dominant current practice is to incentivize and reward scientists to do something completely else, namely publish as much and as fast as possible, with the view on establishing a particular scientific precis, notably in an individual fashion. Now, for scientists, publishing activities take precedence over delivering on societal relevance, and science has become, in a certain way, self-referential. It's scientists who evaluate scientists. Um, this is a self-evident thing almost in science itself, and too little seen as a problem. And this is what I actually do want to problematize. This excellence-driven science is not only free from an undefined form of excellence. Of course, no scientist can tell you what it means, although they decide on it. And at the same time, it drives scientists in a very competitive fashion in terms of getting particular funds. It was investigated some time ago by a Dutch colleague of mine, Bolland, that in Australia, just for a single year, Australian scientists spent collectively more than 5 centuries of their time for preparing 3,500 research proposals in order to get funding. Most of them, of course, got rejected. Now, just imagine if this 5 centuries of time had been used by doing collectively science or collectively doing research on COVID. Okay, so what it reveals here is that scientists actually are incentivized to produce particular outputs, notably publications. Whether they are relevant for somebody or not is secondary. And it is based on a system which measures their productivity or their quality, and I say it between brackets, but because everybody knows that those bibliometric means which are usually used, or the impact factor of journals, everybody knows that this is intellectually attainable. Yet our universities, who are the centers of our intellect, are based on it. This is an attainable situation in my view. If we want to go to open science, and we have to go to open science, and this is the lucky thing about COVID, that if you want to achieve something, you have to collaborate, you have to share information, you have to do this quickly, you cannot wait till you publish it. And people, even if they do minimal contributions to doing in this research, are equally relevant. So the difference and the shift of focus, of course, is not only then that you do open science, yes, because openness is better, it's also, it works. We bring down the timetable for bringing vaccines on the market. And this is the whole thing. So in the end, I think open science leads to a new way of evaluating researchers, and not on the basis on what type of outputs they produce, but on what type of behavior they show and what type of activities they engage in. Central is there, of course, sharing knowledge and data as early as possible. Now, this is captured in this very short graph, which, open science is sometimes wrongly associated with only the open access to publication, but it involves all the elements from the research cycle, from the open research agenda building towards scientific discovery, review, and knowledge dissemination. In all cases, it's about opening up, especially the open research agendas are important to involve other research actors in the research process in order to produce a robust knowledge. It's open in science is thus not only about openness of resources as data and knowledge, but also openness towards knowledge actors. We have tried to do this in the case of Zika and Ebola, and that has been successfully applied indeed in the case of Ebola, but we forgot about it again. We did not want to extend it to other few areas of science. Now COVID speeds this up, and the question is now on the table: why not apply this to all publicly funded research, notably the Sustainable Development Goals? Because equally there we are dependent on fast research and knowledge sharing. Now, let me come to a second point of institutional change which we need, and this is the market failure. When it comes to innovations, we as citizens, we are seen more as a subject of change rather than that we are agents of change. The innovations come over us rather than that we help to co-design them. And I think this is a challenge for RRI. This is also a topic which is less researched in our SWOFs program of the Commission, for example, but yet very important, because responsible innovation in the end constitutes a new paradigm for innovation in which our social system institutionalized collective co-responsibility as a driving force for social desirability, by giving innovation a direction. And this is the whole point, because in the market paradigm I was referring to, it doesn't matter what innovation deliver. Anything is good, and any innovation is regarded as positive because it contributes to our wealth. At least that's the theory. Now, with responsible innovation, we have the challenge to give innovation in a direction. And then, of course, the question is, how can we do that? And we can only do that by changing our relationships, not only in institutional change in the science sphere, as I referred to, but also in the economic sphere and the relationship to our market. In order to address this market failure, and in a certain way, for the good things, we are here dependent on philanthropists. As you all know, this disease which affects most people in Earth, malaria, is predominantly funded by the Melinda and Bill Gates Foundation. They even spend more on it than the whole European Union together. But the problem, of course, with philanthropists is that they can shift their focus, and actually they did, because they took all the money away and put it now to COVID. And this again reveals an unconstitutional failure, I think, when it comes giving some direction to our innovations. And we have to think about new conditions for the market. And they have slowly arisen in the context of RRI. It means we have to work not just with stakeholder participation, but more with stakeholder commitments to particular goals, as we now have on COVID. The deployment of non-legislative actions, codes of conduct, but also, for example, the refraining of IPR and the RTD discovery phase. Because if you do that, then actually you stifle innovation. And if you want to have a vaccine and you try to patent it already in the discovery phase, then the whole thing will last much longer than if you do it in an open way, as actually was practiced in the far past with polio. Just to give an example of a very successful vaccine, but that was not market-based. So there are ideas for that, and this has to be addressed as well. Now, finally, and I think this is the last element of institutional change, or where I will aim at, and that's at our level of public governance. This involves the further institutionalization of collective co-responsibility. As I already said, that means that we have to rearrange our science policy interface, our science policy and market interfaces. But we also have to do something in public governance, because this is the essential lack of public governance in terms of innovation management. We have left it too much to the market. We have, let's say, given it out of our hands too much, and we have means to do so. First of all, I think it means an institutionalization of foresight and technology assessment in public policy, not as currently practiced outside of public policy. I mean, this can continue, but we have to do it inside policy because that only makes foresight a real anticipatory exercise. And it would facilitate us with alternative futures, which then, of course, can become subject of public deliberation in an early phase of the development of the technology. Now, we have means for normative participatory technology design, value sensitive design. I will not elaborate on that, but all these things I think can be used and deployed as means in which ethics becomes a driving force, because then you make the normative assumptions of technology explicit, and you can make it possible to design technologies in a way make it responsive to societal demands. Now, I just want to end with a last element, and I think we just recently at the European level have acknowledged that we have to have a more value-driven innovation system. And I think the current key example from Horizon Europe is a fairly new instrument around mission-oriented research. And mission-oriented research, in our case, will be co-designed and co-created with stakeholders. It will be inclusive. It will have open research agendas. It has a focus on societal desirable outputs, and it will even include, to a significant extent, the participation of citizens. Now, the theory, of course, all sounds very good. We have to see how this works out in practice, but there is one element which I want to highlight here, and maybe some people remember the book of Robert Nelson on the moon and the ghetto, which essentially made clear to us that we brought people on the moon, but we cannot succeed in mission-oriented research. We cannot succeed in solving the problems of the ghetto. And why is that? Why is it? Why is this the case? And why this applies in so many social topics of research that we are not successful, and in technicals we are. Now, this has very much to do with that in our research programs, in our funding programs, we always have put the technological potential at front. In this case, with mission-oriented research under Horizon Europe, the social desirable outputs will be put on front. And if you do that, you have to reorganize your research. And that means also that actually research can be given a direction, and it can be done, and policymakers will listen to you. So this is more or less embedded in the type of research you will do in this case. And this is an enormous challenge which is in front of us, because this will involve enormous variety of stakeholders, enormous variety of individuals, of countries. So this is where the difficulty lies, and I hope this will go well, and I hope that RRI will survive notably in those contexts. So thank you very much for your attention. Again, it was a pleasure to be with you.